I originally started posting videos back in 2020. I had a thing I did for a while on Sundays that I would call Linux Sundays. It was a dedicated solely to a Linux topic. At the time, I wasn't really sure what I was going to be covering, and honestly, some days now, I still not even sure what I will be covering long term. But it's something I've been wanting to resurrect as a concept, but wasn't really sure what form it should take. So I've decided to just jump right in, which is something you have to do sometimes. Now, for Linux Sundays, I will pick up, as of right now, for Linux Sundays, I will pick up an article of Linux news and discuss it with an emphasis on getting a deeper understanding of the issue that's being talked about in the article. But who knows? I could decide next Sunday, and actually next Sunday, actually for the next 2 Sundays, there won't be a video because I'll be traveling. But once I get to a more consistent cadence of release for these videos, who knows what direction that could take. So, yeah, the format will probably change and or fluctuate. So you have been warned. This is B from Tay Talk Tech, and today I will be discussing Linux kernel releases on this episode of Linux Sundays. Had to add the air horn in there. But before I do that, I've got a favor to ask. If you like this type of video and want to see more content like it, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell button for notifications. Also, don't forget to give this video a like if you like it. Let me know what you liked, didn't like, or if you have any comments, questions, concerns, or emotional outbursts down in the comments below. And lastly, stick around all the way to the end to get the most out of this video. Let's do this thing. All right. So let me go ahead and switch to the desktop. All right, we're here in the Firefox browser. All right, so recently on November 27, 2023, Linux had its 32nd birthday. And also on that day, the last maintenance update for kernel 6.5.13, which is the last kernel maintenance update for 6.5, was released. This is exactly 3 months to the day after its initial release, and users using this and distributions using this kernel, the 6.5 kernel, are encouraged to switch to 6.6. Now, this article sparked something in me because I knew that there was differences between kernels, like kernel types and stuff like that, but it made me think. I'm like, well, what kernel am I running? So I pulled up a Linux VM, which is the Fedora server VM, and I ran uname tac-r, which uname will allow you to query, and the /r will allow you to get the kernel information. So in my particular case, I am at 6.5.11-300 FC39, and the architecture's Arch ARM 60, Arch 64. Sorry, yeah. So looking at that, it's like, wait a second, the you're you're currently rocking 6.5.11, and 6.5.13 has already had its last release, and they're encouraging people to upgrade to 6.6. Well, why aren't you on 6.6? Well, this was an interesting question, and it's a question that I had as well, because I didn't think about that. I always thought that any Linux distribution would take the most current kernel version and just automatically, be using a long-term version. But this clearly is not, because they do have long-term versions that are supported for long periods of time. But this is not one of those. And I'll show you some more of this stuff here in just a minute. Now, one thing that I want to start off with saying is that when it comes to kernel releases, it doesn't matter whether it's, just a normal stable release or like a long-term support version. And we'll get into what those are here in a little bit. But there's no real definitive, like, hey, we're going to cover it for this long. It's going to be based on, the feedback they're getting from the community and how much demand there is for it. So the longer and higher demand, there is, the longer they're going to support something. But typically, your stable releases of the mainline kernels are going to be short lived. We're talking like, only a few months. And then your long term ones, they could be looking at about 3 years, just a general time frame. But again, that's going to depend on demand for support of that kernel, and we'll see some here, because it's going to get interesting. So yeah, let's go ahead and talk about the different types of kernels. So Now, there's a few different types of kernels. You have the mainline kernel, which is this one right here, which is like bleeding edge. You have the stable kernel, which is, kind of like, hey guys, use this one. It's the most up-to-date stuff that is stable. You aren't going to have like the issues like you would with 6.7. And then you have the a little bit older stable version, which is this one right here. And then you have these right here. These longer term versions of the kernel, and look at the variety that we have there. We have the most recent long term one being 6.1, and then now we're of course going to be adding the 6.6 to that, and we'll see that here on a different screen. And then we've got all these other long term ones like 5.15. I think that one was like Ubuntu 2020.4. I think was using that one if I'm not mistaken, because I remember the 5.15, and then we've got 5.10, 5.4, 4.19, and then 4.14. And I remember using like CentOS 7, and I was like, man, this kernel's old. And I'm like, is this even like still supported? And I believe it's the 4.14 kernel that's running in there, or at least some kind of version of that. And the thing about it is even if you're running a long-term kernel, it may not necessarily be the bleeding edge. Now, there are like distributions such as Ubuntu, now they update the kernel as well. So you're getting a more recent version of the kernel, which wasn't always the case, and like is not always the case. Like me, I typically gravitate towards using, Debian. If I want some more bleeding edge, I'll go with like, Fedora, because that's going to give me, some of the most up-to-date, stable stuff that's out there. But yeah, like Ubuntu, they update their kernel, so it's a little bit different now. Now the model with it is when it comes to kernel support. Now because if you look at a distribution, especially like one that's maybe got a smaller user base, is they're going to be using an older kernel. They may only release a new version like every 2 to 3 years. They may not use the cadence, such as 6 months like Fedora. 6 to 9 months is Fedora. 6 months to 2 years, as you're looking at with other mainstream ones like Ubuntu. So what ends up happening is, so for example, somebody that's using, Ubuntu 20.4. Now, that person they may be using like a 5.15, they may be using a 5.15 version of the kernel, but say like we saw here where it says 5.15.141, they may be using, let's just say, 5.15.70. But you may be thinking to yourself like, well, isn't that an outdated kernel? Shouldn't they be like updating? Now the thing about it is, and this is where picking your distribution is really going to be important, is because the distribution is actually going to keep their version of the kernel up to date. And basically what they're going to do is they're going to take security fixes, bug fixes, and stuff like that are on newer versions of the kernel, and they're going to backport those to the version. So you got to be careful with your distribution. If you're using like some like itty bitty distribution that is supported by like one person, it may take them longer to update the kernel. And I don't know how this works. I am not a software developer, so I don't know how long it would take somebody to do that. But that is something that you have to take into account when looking at some of these smaller, more obscure um, distributions of Linux. And keep in mind, like if you really wanted to, you could create your own Linux from scratch. You could compile the kernel from source, and you could use the most up to date, burning, bleeding edge kernel that you want, and then always be on the most up to date kernel. But that's going to require you to maintain your system yourself. And some people love doing that. Personally, I have never done it, and I really at this time don't plan on doing it. I think it would be fun to maybe do a video on compiling the kernel. Just sit there and watch me compile it. We can go in like what you do, how to do that, and things like that. And talk about that process, because I do like talking about stuff like that. It's just because my goal really is to help educate and help those of you out there who want to learn more about this stuff, learn more about it. So that's what I'm about. But let's go ahead and continue with the talking about the Linux kernel. So yeah, we have these different types of kernels, and I'll put these articles down in the show notes below. The one I referenced on 6.5 going end of life, as well as some details on 6.6, and then also the current the active kernel releases, which is actually this one right here. These are you've got multiple different types of them. So let's go ahead and talk about these different types. Now, there's like it says here, there are several main categories into which kernel releases may fall. So you have the pre-patch. Pre-patch, or RC, kernels are mainline kernels pre-releases, which explains like why it's a separate category, and are mostly aimed at other kernel developers or Linux enthusiasts. They must be compiled from source and usually contain new features that must be tested before they can be put into a stable release. Pre-patch kernels are maintained and released by Linus Torvalds, the Linux god. So he's the guy who helped develop Linux and has been working on it since 1993. Oh no, I'm sorry, is it 91? I think it is. Yeah, 1991. Yeah, we said 32nd birthday. So yeah, he's in charge of maintaining that. Now you also have the mainline tree, is maintained by Linus Torvalds as well. It's the tree where all new features are introduced and where all existing new development happens. New mainline kernels are released about every 9 to 10 weeks. So and this comes directly from I think it's called the Linux Kernel Foundation. I think maybe I'm not 100% certain on that, but from the group that maintains it. And then the stable, after each mainline kernel is released, it is considered stable. Any bug fixes for a stable kernel are backported from the mainline tree and applied to by a designated stable kernel mainliner. There are usually only a few bug fix kernel releases until next mainline kernel becomes available. Unless it is designated a long-term maintenance kernel, stable kernel updates are released on an as-needed basis, usually once a week. So there we go. They are also backporting these from the the mainline bleeding edge stuff to these little bit older but stable versions. And keep in mind, when you're looking at pre-patch and you're looking at mainline stuff, these are going to be ones that are going to you're probably going to encounter a lot of instability, a lot of bugs, and stuff like that. And some people like doing that. I have not. I was actually thinking about recently, maybe playing around with the newest version of KDE, which is going to be going into desktop 6. So I thought about maybe trying that out through KDE Neon, just to see what it's like. If that's something that you may be interested in, go ahead and let me know down in the comments section below. So, all right, and then the last category is going to be long term. They are usually several long-term maintenance kernels releases provided for the purposes of backporting bug fixes for older kernel trees. Only important bug fixes are applied to such kernels, and they don't usually see very frequent releases, especially for older trees. So just keep in mind that the older the tree is, the less likely it is to get the bug fixes, or the less frequent it's able to get them in. And here they have projected ends of life. And as I stated earlier, there's no definitive date for these. It applies to these as well. It's going to depend on demand. Like we can see here that 4.14 is planning on going end of life January 2024. But if they have like tons of demand for this, and there's like thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of people saying like, hey, we need you to keep running kernel version 4.14, then they may extend that. I don't know what process that takes, but that is something that they could possibly take into account. So, and you can always go to kernel.org to get the most recent up to date. This is just their homepage right here. This is what we looked at before. So yeah, just keep that in mind that you can always see like get projected ends of life. And that's why they call it projected end of life, because it's not definitive. It's tentative. It's tentative in end of life date. So yeah. So that's the cool thing is that we have a large community of people that are maintaining the kernel, maintaining the distributions, and just all the work that they have to put in to maintain these distributions, these kernels, and as well as keeping them up to date. And so just make sure that you're appreciative and of these people that maintain these distributions, because I'm grateful for them every day, because they do the things that I don't want to do. I don't want to sit there and do all these tedious little things that makes that honestly just makes my life a little bit lowers my quality of life slightly, just because it's like I don't like focusing on the itty bitty little minute details and stuff like that, and the little maintenance stuff and things like that. So I'm really grateful for those people. So yeah, yeah, I hope you learned something out of this video. We talked about the kernel versions and stuff like that, and yeah, now you know. Now you know more about kernel versions, kernel releases, cadence, what they are, and all that good stuff, and how distributions maintain those, and all that stuff. Check out this other video from my channel if you haven't already. Remember, mistakes make you better, so keep on making them. Thank you so much for watching my video, and have the greatest of days.